Hello, my name is Dr. Crystal Heath, and I am a shelter veterinarian from Berkeley, California. I also work for nonprofit spay neuter clinics as well as general practice. I volunteer doing animal advocacy work, and my career has led me to see how it is possible for us to do more for animals. A veterinarian can help animals one by one, but getting involved with activism can change the lives of millions of and potentially billions of animals by inspiring social and legislative change for animals. I grew up in rural Northern California, and my neighbors raised pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats. And I was the vice president of my 4-H club. And if you don't know 4-H, it's a group, a youth development program with agriculture roots where children raise and show animals. Some animals are sold to market to be slaughtered at the end of the year. I raised Nubian dairy goats. I also had horses and competed in dressage and eventing. As children, we are all animal activists. When I learned that in my dairy goat project, that if my goats gave birth to boys, I would have to send them to slaughter, I was appalled by this. So I decided not to breed my goats. And that meant that was the end of my goat project. And after that, my goats were just members of our family. We all feel a great deal of compassion for animals when we're kids. We love stories about animals, but along the way, we become normalized to violence against them. A lack of compassion for animals is sometimes viewed as a sign of maturity even. But still, when we enter college, many of us pursue the veterinary profession to help animals. But is the veterinary profession as a whole really helping animals? In the United States, the American Veterinary Medical Association has this veterinary oath, and it states, "Being admitted to the profession of veterinary medicine, I solemnly swear to use my scientific knowledge and skills for the benefit of society through the protection of animal health and welfare, the prevention and relief of animal suffering, the conservation of animal resources, the promotion of public health, and the advancement of medical knowledge. I will practice my profession conscientiously, with dignity, and in keeping with the principles of veterinary medical ethics. I accept as a lifelong obligation the continual improvement of my professional knowledge and competence." There's a key phrase here: conservation of animal resources, which implies that animals are resources here for the benefit of human beings. Throughout this talk, I want you to consider, does this oath need updating? This is the AVMA's policy on animal welfare. The first bullet point states that the responsible use of animals for human purposes, such as companionship, food, fiber, recreation, work, education, exhibition, and research conducted for the benefit of both humans and animals, is consistent with the veterinarian's oath. Should this be the paradigm by which the veterinary profession views animals forever? Does animal use need to be codified in this way, or should our goal be to move away from the use of animals for human purposes? The image on the left illustrates the AVMA's current point of view. Traditionally, we had this concept of a species hierarchy, or the food chain, with man at the top, much like the social hierarchy developed by societies where you have white men at the top, other races, women, children ranked below him, and then animals below that. It fails to recognize how human beings are part of the ecosystem. We are not superior to the animal kingdom. We are part of it. With increased awareness of ethics and justice, our circle of compassion is ever widening to include other groups. While before it was only white male property owners who were owed consideration by the law, gradually other races, women, children, and certain species of animals, dogs, cats, and horses, are entering our circle of compassion too. Alan Bloom is an American philosopher and a professor at Yale, Cornell, University of Chicago, who's quoted as saying, Every age is blind to its own worst madness. In the past, society accepted the subjugation of women, opposed women's rights to vote, supported slavery, infanticide, child labor. But how will future generations look back on our treatment of animals? Humans consume more meat, milk, and eggs than ever before. The mechanization and systematization of intensive farming practices have facilitated this increase in consumption so much that now 70% of all birds on planet Earth are farmed poultry, and 60% of the biomass on this planet is farmed animals. This has drastically affected the biodiversity of planet Earth as we clear land to grow crops to feed farmed animals, with 80% of agricultural land going to feed livestock. And we have lost 83% of our wild animals and 50% of all plant species. Despite knowledge and understanding of animal sentience, advancements in veterinary medicine, and countless scientific papers and books on animal welfare, the average lived experience of animals on this planet is far worse than even 50 years ago. You might have already been aware of the concept of the 5 freedoms, but compare the slides I am about to show you to the 5 freedoms. This concept was originated with the report of the UK Technical Committee to inquire into welfare of animals kept under intensive livestock husbandry systems, which was the Bramble report published in December of 1965. The concept was refined by the Farm Animal Welfare Council in 2009. And these freedoms are the freedom from hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, the freedom from pain, injury, or disease, the freedom to express normal behavior, and the freedom from fear and distress. So look at these chickens. This is how many chickens are raised in intensive farming practices. Do they have a freedom to express normal behavior, a freedom from pain, injury, or disease, a freedom from hunger or thirst, a freedom from fear or distress? I think many of these birds experience all of these things in these practices, are often trampled by others. They get sick. They are not able to get the help that they need, not able to reach food and water. Meanwhile, innovation has enabled producers to pack more and more animals into smaller spaces, raising them more efficiently to produce more meat, milk, and eggs than nature could ever envision. Just look at the massive growth in the number of chickens farmed since 1960. And this chart shows the massive growth in the number of pigs we are farming. And this depicts just how many of them live. These are gestation stalls. On farms that use gestation stalls and farrowing crates, sows spend most of their time in cages 2.5 feet wide by 7 foot long, unable to turn around, forage, and perform other normal behaviors. Is this housing consistent with the 5 freedoms? This practice is fairly new. It was introduced to the United States in 1969 and then widely adopted in the 1980s. And it allowed producers to pack more animals into a smaller space without them fighting with each other, decreasing injuries, and requiring less feed because they move around much less. Some incremental improvements have been made, like the transition from conventional housing to cage-free housing. But when you have this many birds in one building, there are still welfare concerns. And some research even suggests that the welfare might be better in conventional systems versus cage-free systems. But either way, are these birds able to express their 5 freedoms? Just like us, other species use their eyes to see, their ears to hear, their noses to smell, and just like us, they use their brains to think, feel, be aware, and be self-aware. Every body part functions similar to ours, and we use these similarities to us for our benefit, to test drugs and chemicals on them for human safety. But what separates them from us? Why should we not consider these animals to be of moral concern for us? Which brings me to the concept of One Health. This is the idea that human, animal, plant, and environmental health are all interconnected. And it encourages professionals in different fields such as human medicine, veterinary medicine, ecology, and public health to work together to achieve optimum health outcomes. In fact, 75% of emerging human diseases come from animals. The pandemics of the past, from the 1918 Spanish flu to the 2009 swine flu to COVID-19, all came from our interactions with animals. And influenza is likely going to be one of the pandemics that we have to fear. Again, influenza A viruses readily mutate because they are comprised of 8 negative sense single-stranded RNA, and pigs and birds share similar receptors for influenza A viruses as we do. Intensive farming practices with high numbers of genetically similar animals packed into barns while also interfacing with human workers sets up the perfect scenario to create the next influenza pandemic. And we are seeing an increase in emerging infectious diseases. The following graphs come from this letter in Nature. Here you can see an increase in frequency since 1940. The spike in 1990 was due to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. The smaller column in 2000 does not mean it's decreasing in frequency. The overall trend is still increasing. And then there's concern about antibiotic resistance. 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are sold for use in animal agriculture. And recently, the World Health Organization called antimicrobial resistance an increasingly serious threat to global public health that requires action across all government sectors and society. Antibiotics are administered to animals in feed to marginally improve growth rates and to prevent infections when hundreds and thousands of animals are confined in close quarters in intensive farming practices. The WHO expects this to increase dramatically worldwide over the next 15 years. There is growing evidence that antibiotic resistance in humans is promoted by the widespread use of non-therapeutic antibiotics in animals. This chart shows emerging infectious diseases caused by drug-resistant microbes versus non-drug resistant. Drug-resistant microbes represent 20.9% of emerging infectious disease events in their database. The number of drug-resistant microbes have significantly increased with time, and this is likely related to a corresponding rise in antimicrobial drug use, particularly in high-latitude developed countries. Susan Lieberman, Vice President of the Wildlife Conservation Society, a leader in the One Health movement, is quoted as saying, "The impediments to One Health in the past and moving forward are entrenched economic interests. The activities that cause emerging diseases are the same activities that give us palm oil in every food product, the metals in our phones, the fur trim on our winter jackets. They are the wildlife trade, the mining industry, the industrial meat production industry, industrial agriculture, fossil fuel production, urban sprawl, all the things that tear up animal habitats, wipe out species, and put humans, livestock, and wildlife in abundant contact. To take One Health to its logical conclusion would mean truly confronting these forces of commercial expansion and exploitation. It would mean ending factory farming and an end to the commercial wildlife trade." Is fur a morally or ethically acceptable use of animals? There are alternatives, and fur-bearing animals are wild animals kept in unnatural conditions and killed via anal electrocution. Should we use our profession to protect these animals or perpetuate their exploitation? Activists, through protests, demonstrations, have worked for decades to raise awareness about the plight of animals and make wearing fur less socially acceptable, and have pressured brands to drop fur from their lines. New legislation has been popping up around the world to ban the sale of fur and fur farming in various municipalities. And we know mink do get COVID-19 from humans, and they can give COVID-19 back to humans as well as other animals. So they are a reservoir for this disease. With the activist group Direct Action Everywhere, I lobby to support the fur ban. The voice of a veterinarian holds a lot of weight with legislators, but sadly, veterinary associations have been not supportive of this type of legislation, as their ideology of defending the human use of animals is not consistent with ending the fur industry. And you will see shortly just how corporate interests affect the veterinary profession's positions on these issues. The veterinary profession sets the standard for how animals are treated by society. And people know that the veterinary profession is extremely influential in setting public policy and legislation. And the animal ag industry knows this, and they have been extremely strategic in just how they keep the veterinary profession on their side. Thankfully for us and the animals, the fur ban passed. And as a result of the 5th largest economy stopping the sale of fur, Macy's, Bloomingdale's, and many other brands stopped carrying fur, and even the Queen of England stopped wearing fur. But have you been exposed to anti-animal rights bias or sentiment in your education? I know I was, and here's an example. This is a slide from a Principles of Animal Science class at a college in Yuba, California. It states that animal rights activists often misinform the public, use violence and stunts in order to receive donations for their organizations to help animals. It makes no mention of how corporate agribusiness often misinforms the public about how well their animals are treated by showing them frolicking in green grass when in reality, they're housed in warehouses, unable to go outside or even see grass. They also say animal rights activists often use violence when in reality, violence goes against the ideals of animal rights activism, which advocates for compassion. On the other hand, animal rights activists have been killed and persecuted by the animal agriculture industry. Agribusiness systematizes violence, not just towards animals, but many workers are hurt, injured, and killed on the job as well. One would think that veterinarians would address animal rights much the same way pediatricians have been advocates for child's rights over the past century, working to end child exploitation and child labor, but that's not the case. The two professions are very similar, though, in that our patients are unable to advocate for themselves. So what's keeping sort of these more compassionate perspectives out of the veterinary profession? Let me tell you one story of just the blatant gatekeeping that happens. One veterinarian I know applied to the University of Missouri College of Veterinary Medicine. The student knew the importance of appeasing the admissions committee, known for their close ties to animal agriculture, and on her application did not say anything that would ruin her chances of getting in. But someone the student knew also knew a person on the admissions committee. This acquaintance wanted to be helpful, but they did not know the sensitive nature of the admissions process. This acquaintance told this member of the admissions committee, "You should really let her in. She loves animals so much. She's vegan." But this person on the admissions board was a pork producer and exclaimed, "A vegan will be admitted over my dead body." But blatant gatekeeping isn't the only factor. There's also self-selection. The second issue is that really empathetic people self-select against entering the profession because they don't want to see animal suffering. They have ethical concerns about the gratuitous use and careless treatment of animals early in their education, in dissection labs or terminal surgery labs in college. The pervasive issue of compassion fatigue and psychological distress in the field creates an unwelcoming environment for many empathetic and compassionate people who, after a few hours of veterinary job experience, may decide to self-select against pursuing veterinary school. Not only are animal ag industry people on the admission boards of these schools, but the animal ag industry donates huge sums of money to veterinary schools. And this influences the questions that are asked in science and what perspectives are centered. Just as an example, Iowa State Pork Producers Association gave over $1 million to Iowa State Vet School. And you have people who formally work in industry organizations like the National Pork Board, teaching in our veterinary schools, centering these corporate interests. As a result, facilitating the growth of industry takes precedence over the animals. This is Dan Thompson, who is the chair of the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State. His father was the dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine. He has a lot of industry ties. He serves on the Animal Welfare Board of Tyson, as well as the McDonald's Beef Health and Welfare Committee and Yum Brands Animal Welfare Council. Yum Brands includes KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and Habit Burger. He clearly has an agenda and economic incentive to perpetuate the expansion of animal agriculture and has a lot of influence in how the next generation is taught. On the other hand, I have been denied the opportunity to speak at veterinary schools, and I would likely not even be able to present this talk at any United States veterinary school. Prestige is a huge poultry and pork producer, and they gave a large donation to North Carolina State University, creating the Prestige Department of Poultry Science. Do you think this department will work to center the interests of the birds or the interests of corporate agribusiness? I will show you later just exactly what kind of research they do. But in order for there to be a dedicated workforce of people willing to legitimize large-scale animal suffering, compassion has to be suppressed and violence towards animals must be normalized. This quote is from the book, A New Basis for Animal Ethics by Dr. Bernard Rowland, who taught at Colorado State University. It says, at one veterinary school, a senior class provided each student with a dog, and the student was required to do a whole semester of surgery on the animal. One student anesthetized the animal, beat on it randomly with a sledgehammer, and then spent the semester repairing the damage. He received an A. And while this likely took place a long time ago, survival surgeries where animals are kept alive to have multiple surgeries performed on them are no longer done. The more ethical alternative has become terminal surgeries where animals are operated on, but then never allowed to wake up and recover. Thankfully, this is being viewed as unethical as well and devaluing our patient's life. But still, even today, students are tasked with participating in cruel experiments on animals for the benefit of industry, which I will talk a little bit more about later. By contrast, this student, Dr. Stephanie Fraisel, had to accept an F for refusing to participate in a surgical program where an animal would be killed at Auburn University. She was scolded by faculty, faced threats of expulsion for not complying, and was mocked by her fellow students. But she stuck to her values. But it shouldn't have to be this way. These are veterinarians who were conscientious objectors to terminal surgeries in veterinary schools and worked to create alternatives. This is Dr. Andrew Knight, Dr. Kirsten Rosenberg, and Dr. Britton Hammett-McCurry. I am thankful in particular to Dr. Rosenberg's act of being a conscientious objector at UC Davis because it likely led to UC Davis abandoning their core terminal surgery program. I never had to perform a surgery on an animal who was to be killed. We had an access to care model, which many schools are adopting, where students learn on animals who actually need surgery. Families bring in their animals for a discounted surgical fee, and students learn under the guidance of experienced surgeons. The student gets the opportunity to watch the animal recover from surgery, manage their pain, advise their caretaker afterwards, and manage any complications. All opportunities that are missed in terminal surgery programs. And even though I never participated in terminal surgeries, surgery is now my favorite part of practice. But as schools remove terminal surgeries from their programs, the animal agriculture industry's interests attack them and have done a great job of instilling fear into veterinary students that they will not be adequately trained in surgery because of activists. And because of this, schools are afraid to openly admit whether they do terminal surgeries or not. There's a lack of transparency about it, and students wanting to avoid attending schools that still do terminal surgeries have a hard time determining what schools those are. And here's a trigger warning. There are some dead bodies on the next screen, so be warned. You can look away if you want to. There is something even more disturbing that the animal ag industry wants the veterinary profession to legitimize. They need to solve a problem that has been created by large-scale intensive farming practices. And that problem is when there's a supply chain disruption or a foreign animal disease outbreak, how do you kill tens of millions of animals as cheaply and efficiently as possible when they can't go to slaughter? This is a problem we would never have had 100 years ago. There used to be an ancient, albeit non-consensual contract with the animals. We would provide them with food, shelter, protection, and a painless death, and they would provide us with meat. If something happened on the farm, a farmer would easily and quickly be able to kill all the animals themselves. But with intensive farming practices, when you have hundreds of thousands of animals at a single facility, that's impossible. And the veterinary profession has been tasked with coming up with macabre workarounds for this. And starting in 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants failed to adequately protect their workers. And despite President Trump invoking the Defense Production Act to keep slaughterhouses open, too many workers were too sick and too scared to go back to work. This reduced slaughter capacity by nearly 50%. And pork production is a highly scheduled, mechanized, and systematized process, and the pigs grow very fast. So they quickly outgrew their minimal pen space. Up to 10 million pigs needed to be killed en masse or depopulated because there just wasn't any room on the slaughter lines. To kill the pigs, they used a method known as ventilation shutdown plus, where they seal up the barns, pump in heat and steam, and watch as the animals die slowly of heat stroke over many hours. The ones that remain alive were then killed via a captive bolt gun. Whistleblower footage of this cruelty taking place at Iowa Select Farms garnered international media attention. The public was outraged by this, and spokesperson for Iowa Select Farms, Jen Sorensen, who then became president of the National Pork Producers Council, said that they were using veterinary approved methods in accordance with the American Veterinary Medical Association and the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. Many of us were horrified to see our profession used in this way to shroud this practice in legitimacy. I, along with several other veterinarians who were appalled by this practice, founded the website Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown. The website asked the AVMA to reclassify ventilation shutdown as a not recommended form of mass killing. Producers should be compelled to put plans in place to use preferred methods, and over 1,500 veterinarians have signed on to the petition. As a result, a petition was submitted to the AVMA House of Delegates to consider a resolution reclassifying ventilation shutdown as a not recommended form of depopulation. The proposal was submitted late. However, it made history. This was the first time ever the AVMA House of Delegates refused to hear a late submission. But when it was heard, sadly, 99.1% of the House of Delegates voted to refer the resolution to the AVMA Board of Directors with a recommendation to refer the proposal to the AVMA panel on depopulation for consideration. They didn't want to step on anybody's toes. And after all, this panel on depopulation is a panel of 60 experts. Who are they to decide that they know more than these so-called experts? 99.1% could not take a stand on roasting pigs alive. And let's just clarify what reclassifying it would do. It would mean that producers could still use ventilation shutdown. They just couldn't say that they were using AVMA approved methods in their communications, and they wouldn't get USDA indemnity payments for this practice. But in this article, no dissenting opinion was presented on ventilation shutdown. In fact, it concludes with Dr. Michael Zager stating, we have African swine fever in the Dominican Republic, there's avian influenza. There are going to be times when this is needed, like it or not. Like it or not. To me, that's saying that the AVMA doesn't think that there's any humane way to raise animals for food if we have to leave killing them by the tens of millions via heat stroke as an option. So maybe the AVMA should be advocating for a scaling down of animal agriculture and working to prevent the need for depopulation in the first place. This is a case study published in August 2021, where they killed 243,016 pigs via ventilation shutdown. There are many flaws and false conclusions made by this study, which are described in an open letter to the AVMA and signed by dozens of veterinarians. The authors of this study wanted and needed to show that 95% of the pigs died in less than an hour in order to fit the AVMA guidelines on depopulation. And they showed that not by starting the clock when the ventilation was shut down and when heat was added, but when the temperature inside reached a scorching 130 degrees, which was 15 to 94 minutes later. In reality, it took 90.4 minutes for nursing pigs to die and 110.3 minutes for finishing pigs to die. One incident took over 2.5 hours. So they just adjusted the start time in order to fit the requirements of the depopulation guidelines. And despite the paper claiming no financial conflicts of interest, all the authors on this paper have close ties to industry. The lead author, Dr. Angela Basinger, is the animal welfare lead at Merck, a pharmaceutical company that sells vaccines and medications to the swine industry. She has an interest in defending the swine industry. She is also on the board of the Animal Agricultural Alliance, which is a nonprofit group that supports billion-dollar corporations by stalking the social media of activists and attempting to discredit them. This group attempted to silence and discredit me, which led to an investigative report by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. You can read more about that here. And Angela Basinger is also vice president of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. Another leader is a co-author. They denied me membership to the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, me and another veterinarian who also spoke out about ventilation shutdown. So after we tried to join and be a part of this conversation, they then shut down their membership portal and did not allow any new members to join. And supposedly because they are changing their bylaws so to make sure that people with our views are not allowed entrance into the group. And this creates like this little group that is not working, does not share the values of the public, the general public. Like they have very extremist views about how animals should be treated, because most people are horrified by ventilation shutdown and many of the practices used by the swine industry. So these are the other authors on that paper, and they all have close industry ties, one even formerly working for the largest pork producer in the world, Smithfield. So I had concerns about this case study, and I drafted a letter to the editor of JAVMA criticizing ventilation shutdown. I focused on the issue of overcrowding and poor planning by the industry and how we should take steps to ensure that this never has to happen again. My final paragraph states, we encourage the AVMA to focus on creating evidence-based policies and recommendations that improve the health and protect the welfare of the animals under our care. According to the report, the choice to kill pigs using VSD plus TH was the direct result of poor planning, not due to a zoonotic or animal disease epidemic, natural disaster, or biosecurity concern. Further, the producers cited that the fact that VSD plus was permitted under constrained circumstances by the AVMA as justification for their actions. We believe this deliberate misinterpretation of the AVMA depopulation guidelines by pork producers without objection by the AVMA potentially encourages continued use of VSD plus in the future. If we do not take action as a profession to course correct, one can only imagine what future atrocities our profession will seek to rationalize. I received an email back from JAVMA stating that they have decided to stop the debate on this controversial subject and we're no longer accepting any additional letters. Stop debate is an interesting phrase because to date they had not published anything critical of ventilation shutdown. And I posted this letter on a blog on the Our Honor website and received a letter back from another veterinarian who also wrote a critical letter to the editor and also received a reply from JAVMA stating they wouldn't publish her letter either. Luckily, JAVMA did publish 2 critical letters, but the authors were given a chance to respond. Our letters are only able to be 500 words. The authors were given 800 words to respond. Of course, not only do the animals suffer, but the human workers, farmers, and veterinarians suffer as well. This research published by the same authors shows how 10% of swine veterinarians considered suicide due to the psychological impacts of depopulation. And many needed mental health counseling too. The term is perpetrator-induced traumatic stress. They are victims of the system too, and their identity as animal helpers is put at odds with corporate and public demands and pressure for cheap meat. And we are forcing these mental health impacts onto the next generation of students who have to work to devise new macabre workarounds for intensive farming practices. And students go in respecting and trusting their professors, wanting to be involved in research, and then they are tasked, once they enter the lab, with doing this kind of research. And these are student posters that were presented at a swine veterinary conference. And this one involves killing of pigs using gas engine exhaust. Here is another where students were forced to drown pigs in foam. Shouldn't students with their enthusiasm and passion for the field instead be tasked with figuring out how to end the need for depopulation in the first place and how to create a world with more compassion for animals? I spoke to the former chief veterinarian of the Food Safety and Inspection Service, Dr. Pat Basu, who is quoted as saying in the New York Times, "When it comes to power, no one dares to stand up to the pork industry, not even the US government." He was frustrated that it became more and more clear industry was regulating itself to the detriment of public health. In 2022, highly pathogenic avian influenza swept across the United States. To date, more than 40 million birds have been killed. And ventilation shutdown plus heat is quickly becoming the industry standard method of depopulation, as producers have no incentive to put plans in place to use preferred methods of depopulation. This is a screenshot from the study done on birds at the Prestige Department of Poultry Science. And this was at North Carolina State University. They put these birds in boxes. Some they just closed off the ventilation, others they pumped in heat, and they watched to see how long it would take for them to die. The research was funded via a $100,000 grant from a poultry industry trade group. And it was not a peer-reviewed study. It was merely a report so poorly written that parts of it it was difficult to figure out what the author was attempting to communicate. But this is the sole reason ventilation shutdown plus was put in the AVMA guidelines on depopulation. And there's a link to the article here that describes this in much more detail in my notes. But this graphic illustrates just how corporate interests have captured our research institutions. Science depends on what questions we ask, and the questions that are asked tend to center industry interests, practices that the industry wants, and then is validated by these research institutions. Then the AVMA panels take this research that was industry-funded research and puts it in the guidelines, giving it this shroud of the veterinary profession's moral authority. And these guidelines are used then by the USDA to implement policy. And the USDA, which is a taxpayer-funded organization, gives money back to producers when things go awry and they have to kill their animals. So the industry kind of creates the ways that they want to mass kill their animals. That research goes to these institutions, these research universities. That research is then incorporated into the guidelines. And then the guidelines are then used to set public policy and then indemnity payments back to the producers. This is just one example from the farm of billionaire Glenn Taylor. He owns Rembrandt Enterprises, an egg production company in Iowa. In 2015, he had to kill 5.5 million of his birds because of an avian influenza outbreak. He received 11.3 million in taxpayer subsidies for doing this. His farm, located under the Mississippi Flyway, was at risk for another outbreak. And again, this year, his farm was infected and he had to kill 5.3 million of his birds, but he never put a plan in place to use AVMA preferred methods of depopulation. And his practices continued to create the very constrained circumstances that necessitated the use of ventilation shutdown as a killing method in the first place. And this photo is a picture of one of the hens of Rembrandt who survived ventilation shutdown. And you can only imagine like what she experienced and how she feels after enduring hours of a practice that was meant to kill her. And going through the records from these depopulation events, it frequently took 8 hours or more for birds to be killed. And it's much harder to kill the birds via heat stroke than it is pigs. Afterwards, many of the birds are still alive, so workers have to go in and they perform cervical dislocation on the birds to kill the remaining ones. And activists take serious legal risks to bring this type of footage to the public. In response to activist footage of VSD in 2012 at Iowa Select Farms, the animal agriculture industry passed another law saying trespass onto food production operation would result in up to 2 years in prison. And the animal ag industry has really ramped up fear of animal rights activists. Articles are published regularly about how farmers need to protect themselves from dangerous animal rights activists. Be careful, your next barroom buddy could be an animal rights activist. One industry publication bragged that despite the efforts of plant-based meats and animal activists, the average American consumed a record-breaking 223.7 pounds of meat in 2019, which is 3 times more than a century ago. And now they're strategizing more ways to increase consumption. In a Growth and Innovations webinar put on by the National Pork Board, Mohan Sahani, a professor at Northwestern University, said, if you build a habit, something they do day in and day out, you've got a great business. Google is a toothbrush. Facebook is a toothbrush. We've got to make pork into a toothbrush, not something that's exotic that you do occasionally. He wants the world to eat pork every day, a habit that will hurt even more animals and people while lining the CEO's pocketbooks. Thankfully, some livestock veterinarians, seeing these horrors firsthand, are becoming activists themselves. This is a former pig veterinarian turned animal rights activist, Dr. Alice Brough. She's speaking out against what she participated in, and as a result, has faced retaliation by the industry for shining a light on the cruelty that exists in the UK. But activism works. As a shelter veterinarian, I am proud that we have made great strides in saving homeless dogs and cats from abuse and neglect. In the 1970s, 13.5 million animals were killed in shelters each year. And because of the efforts of activists working together with shelters, that number has dropped by some reports to less than 1 million in the United States. That's because a shift happened in our culture. And due to the tireless efforts of activists drawing attention to the plight of dogs and cats, people joined together to pass laws, protect animals, form rescue groups to help municipal shelters, improved accessibility to spay-neuter services, and pressured shelter management to change their systems to prioritize compassion. I graduated UC Davis in 2012. This is a photo of the UC Davis class of 1970, a very white, male-dominated profession. And this is the generation that facilitated the mechanized, systematized exploitation of animals via massive growth and expansion of factory farming. This is the vet school class of 2023. It's much more diverse and female-dominated. I know vet students today care about climate change, justice, and science, and you have the power to change the world, to relieve the pain and suffering of billions of animals whose lives have been reduced to units of production. You can help us envision a world where we can use our ingenuity to help animals instead of hurt them. How comfortable, though, are you in your ability to stand up to and question your professors? How is the issue of animal rights discussed in your schools? How are vegans and vegetarians treated? I recently heard one story where a professor asked all vegans and vegetarians to stand up, and he proceeded to berate them in front of their classmates. This is Dr. Daniela Castillo, a Latina veterinarian from Oaxaca, Mexico. She recently attended the AVMA convention in Philadelphia. Protesters were outside raising awareness about the AVMA's position on ventilation shutdown, and Dr. Castillo held her own banner explaining why she is a vegan veterinarian and calling for her colleagues to speak up against ventilation shutdown. She was shoved from behind by an older white male veterinarian and told to get out of the way. Again, another example of the violence and oppression faced by those trying to create a more compassionate world. And some people say it's the natural order, a part of the food chain. The lion eats the gazelle. But the lion does not confine gazelles by the thousands against their will, selectively breed gazelles to produce more meat than nature ever intended, give them vaccines and antibiotics so that they are able to survive close confinement with thousands of others. The lion does not also grow monoculture crops and then truck them miles to feed the gazelles and then have lions from marginalized populations kill gazelles by the hundreds of thousands for hours each day while other lions get to avoid seeing this pain and destruction. And humans are unique in all the animal kingdom. We are able to grow our own food and we have the ability to heal others. We also have the ability to use science and to recognize and relieve the suffering of others. Our life does not depend on the killing of other species, and instead we can consider and work for the best interests of others. What if the goal of the veterinary profession was to use our innovation and ingenuity to create a world to do just that? We could move to the model on the right where we recognize that we are not superior to these other species. Ultimately, a scaling down of animal agriculture and encouraging consumption of plant-based diets benefits us all. And more studies are showing the health benefits of a plant-based diet. And professional athletes are switching to plant-based diets to achieve optimum performance. And history has shown us that as human society evolves and grows, we continue to open our circles of compassion to include other groups that were previously marginalized and victimized. We all want a world with less suffering, but there are entrenched economic interests, habits, and traditions that prevent us from achieving those goals. Activism helps spark the conversation, raise awareness, and change these systems. And I hope you will consider embracing activism and joining a movement you are passionate about with others to make a kinder world. And here's my contact info as well, and links to the presentation to review. Please feel free to reach out for any reason, or if you would like access to the papers or other information or videos that I mentioned today. And thank you very much for your time.